The cool, whispering breeze of a late summer evening carried the scent of freshly cut grass and blooming jasmine through the quiet, tree-lined streets of Pine Grove Lane. This was the kind of neighborhood that spoke of meticulous care and discreet wealth, where the only sounds after dusk were the gentle rustle of oak leaves and the distant, occasional hum of a luxury sedan gliding into a three-car garage. Streetlights cast soft, haloed pools of light on manicured lawns and pristine sidewalks, creating a tableau of suburban serenity. Into this still-life painting, a single figure moved. His name was Michael. He walked with a steady, unhurried pace along the sidewalk, his hands tucked into the pockets of a plain gray hoodie. Beneath it, a simple t-shirt and a pair of dark, worn-in jeans. His footwear was practical, sturdy sneakers designed for comfort over miles, not for fashion. To any casual glance from a window, he might be a man taking an evening stroll, perhaps a new neighbor familiarizing himself with the streets, but his eyes betrayed a different purpose. They were not gazing dreamily at garden gnomes or architectural details. They were active, analytical. His gaze darted with a trained, subtle precision from one house to the next, lingering on roof lines, noting the make and model of cars and driveways, scanning mailbox numbers. He didn't stop walking, but his observational rhythm was methodical, a silent cataloging. There was a quiet confidence in his posture, an economy of movement that suggested control, but his casual attire placed him as an outsider in this world of tailored landscaping and imported sedans. He was a question mark in a neighborhood of periods. And in this neighborhood, someone was paid to eliminate question marks, parked in the deep shadow at the corner of a cul-de-sac. Just beyond the reach of the closest streetlight, Officer Ben Craig sat in his patrol cruiser. The dashboard's glow illuminated the weary lines of his face. He was finishing a lukewarm cup of gas station coffee, the bitter taste matching his general disposition toward the tail end of a slow shift. His mind was on his couch, the game highlights he'd missed. Then, movement. His cop's instinct, honed by 15 years of scanning for the irregular, flickered. His eyes narrowed, tracking the lone pedestrian. He watched for a full minute, his initial boredom curdling into something sharper. The man wasn't walking a dog. He wasn't jogging. He wasn't on his phone. He was just looking, scanning. In a neighborhood where everyone belonged somewhere specific, this man's purpose was unreadable. And to Craig, unreadable meant suspicious. "What's this guy's deal?" Craig muttered to the stale air in his car, his voice a low grumble. His mind, a slide reel of past calls and ingrained biases, began to jump ahead of the evidence. Prowler, casing houses, drug deal lookout. The man's skin tone, darker than any resident Craig could recall on his patrol roster, cemented the narrative in a synaptic flash. Assumption outpaced observation. Reason was lapped by a deep, unexamined prejudice Craig would never articulate, even to himself. He saw Michael pause near a particularly large brick colonial. The man didn't approach the door. He didn't peer into windows. He simply stood for a moment, then produced a small black pocket notebook from his jeans. He uncapped a pen and jotted something down, his head tilting slightly as he looked at the house number. That sealed it for Craig. The notebook was the clincher. In his experience, only two kinds of people took notes on houses. People working for a utility company and they drove marked trucks and wore vests, and people planning a crime. A slow, cold smirk touched Craig's lips. Gotcha. He didn't turn on his siren. He didn't need to. Full. He simply flipped his headlights from parking beams to full illumination, flooding Michael in a sudden, stark white glare that shattered the evening's calm. The cruiser, a silent predator, crept forward, tires crunching softly on the asphalt. In the cone of light, Michael didn't startle. He didn't jump or drop his notebook. He finished his note with a deliberate stroke, recapped his pen, and slipped both back into his pocket. Then, and only then, did he turn slowly to face the advancing light, his hand rising to shield his eyes. His posture remained relaxed, but his expression, what Craig could see of it, was unreadable, a calm, neutral mask. Craig pulled the cruiser to a stop at the curb, the engine idling. He took a moment, a power play, letting the man stand illuminated in the intrusive light. He adjusted his duty belt, the heavy weight of his gun, and cuffs of familiar comfort. This was the part he knew, the establishment of control. With a final decisive sip of his now cold coffee, Officer Ben Craig opened his door and stepped out into the gentle summer evening, his boots hitting the pavement with an authoritative thud. The stage was set for a confrontation built entirely on a foundation of one man's swift, terrible, and confident assumption. The sudden, blinding wash of headlights had frozen the suburban evening in a stark theatrical tableau. Officer Craig's cruiser sat at the curb like a predator that had cornered its quarry, engine rumbling softly. For a long moment, the only movement was the faint swirl of dust motes caught in the harsh beams, dancing around the still figure of Michael. Michael lowered the hand shielding his eyes, allowing them to adjust. He didn't speak, didn't offer a nervous smile or a preemptive greeting. He simply waited, his posture relaxed yet attentive, as if observing an interesting but not particularly threatening species of wildlife. This calm, this refusal to perform the expected dance of startled guilt or fawning apology was the first note of dissonance that irked Officer Craig. Craig closed his patrol car door with a solid, metallic thunk that was meant to sound authoritative. He took his time, adjusting his utility belt, letting the heavy weight of his sidearm, pepper spray, and handcuffs settle against his hip. Each piece of equipment was a punctuation mark in the sentence of his authority. He then began his approach, his boots striking the sidewalk with measured, deliberate thuds that echoed in the quiet street. He stopped about 6 feet from Michael, well inside the boundary of personal space, planting his feet in a wide, stable stance. You, Craig's voice, wasn't a question. It was a command, a flat, toneless probe designed to elicit a flinch. It carried the weariness of a long shift but was edged with a sharp, ready aggression. Michael turned his head slightly, meeting the officer's gaze. The streetlight above them cast deep shadows under Craig's brow, making his eyes seem like dark pits. Michael's own face was illuminated clearly, his expression neutral, composed. "Evening, officer," Michael said. His voice was calm, even pleasant, but it held a steady center. It was the voice of a man standing on solid ground. "What are you doing around here?" Craig asked, his eyes performing a rapid, invasive scan. The plain hoodie, the jeans, the sneakers, no logos, no jewelry, nothing that spoke of belonging in Pine Grove Lane. The mental file in Craig's mind stamped outsider in bold red letters. "Just doing some work," Michael replied, offering a small, polite smile that didn't quite reach his observant eyes. His hands remained visible at his sides. "Work." Craig repeated the word, letting it hang in the air like a bad smell. He injected it with a heavy dose of skepticism. "You live around here." Michael shook his head once, a slow, deliberate motion. "No, but Craig cut him off, taking a half step closer. "Yeah." The distance between them was now uncomfortable, intimidatory. "Then why are you in this neighborhood? It's pushing 9 o'clock. He said this neighborhood as if it were a fortress Michael had breached. Michael took a measured breath, a subtle shift the officer caught and misinterpreted as hesitation. He could feel the tectonic plates of the interaction shifting, the officer's demeanor hardening from procedural suspicion into something more personal, more pointed. "I'm not doing anything wrong, officer. Just taking notes for a project." Notes. Craig's eyes instantly dropped to Michael's front pocket, where the outline of the small notebook was just visible. His interest, predatory and sharp, locked onto it. "What kind of project?" "Nah." His voice was a low, insistent grind. Michael hesitated again, this time more noticeably. It was the hesitation of a man weighing obligations, considering the security of information against the desire for a simple resolution. "I'd rather not say," he said, his tone still respectful. "Let's sensitive work." To Craig, the answer was a gift. It was evasion. It was confirmation of his narrative. In the binary logic of his bias, a lawful person with nothing to hide would explain. A person who hedged, who claimed a sensitive work while dressed like a civilian, was hiding guilt. The officer's suspicion, warmed by prejudice, now reached a simmer. The quiet street seemed to amplify the tension. The rustle of a sprinkler system kicking on 2 houses down sounded like a roar. "You'd rather not say?" Craig echoed, his voice dropping to a low, confrontational growl. He took another subtle step, invading the space completely. The invisible line of civil discourse had been crossed. Now it was about dominance. "Look, you don't belong here. You're wandering around after dark, scribbling in a notebook. So you can either explain yourself to my satisfaction, or we're going to have a problem." The threat, vague but potent, hung in the humid air. Michael's calm demeanor didn't fracture, but it solidified. The polite veneer cooled by several degrees. He held his ground, physically and metaphorically. "Officer, I'm not breaking any laws. I'm on a public sidewalk. I have a right to be here." His tone was firm, layered with a quiet authority that conflicted directly with Craig's performative command. It was the wrong response. Craig's jaw clenched. He didn't like being challenged. He didn't like this man's composure. In the officer's mind, respect was demonstrated through deference, through nervousness, through the acknowledgement of his power. This calm, firm resistance felt like an affront. Craig's right hand, which had been resting on his belt, drifted back. His thumb brushed subconsciously against the retention strap of his holster, a gesture not of intent to draw, but of reminding himself, and the man before him, of the ultimate power differential. The night air, once cool and gentle, now felt charged and still, waiting for the spark that both men sensed was coming. The conversation was over. The interrogation had begun. The standoff beneath the streetlight had solidified into something hard and cold. The polite fictions of evening, officer, and just doing some work had evaporated, leaving behind the bare metal of the conflict. Officer Craig's unwavering conviction that he was facing a criminal, and Michael's immovable insistence on his own innocence. The humid air between them seemed to warp, thickening with unspoken threats and bruised ego. Craig's eyes, narrowed to slits, flickered with open frustration. His thumb was still hooked on his duty belt, a hair's breadth from his holster. Michael's last words, "I have a right to be here," echoed in the silence, a direct challenge to Craig's authority that demanded a response. "You need to stop being evasive," Craig barked, his voice losing its professional cadence and sharpening into a personal rebuke. He took another step forward, crowding Michael, using his body to impose intimidation. "Tell me exactly what you're doing here." Now, Michael didn't retreat. He took a deliberate half-step back, not in fear, but to reestablish a boundary, to reclaim a fragment of personal space from the officer's invasion. He kept his hands open and visible at his sides, a study in non-threatening posture that somehow seemed to mock Craig's aggression. His voice, when he spoke, was a study in controlled calm. "I've explained what I can, officer. I'm doing my job. There's no law against being on a public street, observing and taking notes." Your job," Craig scoffed, the word dripping with sarcasm. He gestured vaguely at the manicured homes around them. "What kind of job involves wandering around people's houses at night, scribbling in a notebook? You expect me to buy that? Sounds to me like you're casing the place, looking for an easy score." The accusation, casing, hung in the air, ugly and direct. It was the crystallization of every assumption Craig had made since he first saw Michael's silhouette against the brick colonial. Michael's face remained a placid mask, though a flicker of something, not anger, but a profound, weary annoyance, crossed his eyes like a shadow. "I'm not casing anything, officer, and I'd appreciate it if you stopped making baseless accusations." "A baseless?" Craig stiffened, his pride punctured. The man's composure was a weapon, and it was scoring hits. "A funny. I don't see you offering any proof otherwise. All I see is a guy who won't give a straight answer in a neighborhood where he clearly doesn't fit." His gaze dropped pointedly again to Michael's front pocket. "What's in the notebook?" "That's what this is about, isn't it? Hand it over." He extended his hand, palm up, in a gesture that was more command than request. The streetlight glinted off his badge. It was no longer an investigation. It was a demand for surrender. Michael hesitated. His hand moved almost imperceptibly toward his pocket, then stopped. He clutched the fabric slightly, as if feeling the outline of the book beneath. "It's private, officer. I'm under no obligation to show it to you. You have no probable cause." That was the tipping point. The legal terminology spoken so calmly was the final insult. In Craig's mind, the law was his tool, his narrative to wield. For this man to invoke it against him was an act of rebellion. "Oh, don't you lecture me on probable cause," Craig snarled, his patience snapping like a dry twig. The professional facade vanished entirely, replaced by raw, bullish authority. "You're acting suspicious, you're refusing to identify your purpose, and now you're withholding evidence. That's all the cause I need." He moved, not with the careful procedure of a peace officer, but with the impulsive aggression of a man whose authority has been questioned. His hand shot out not for the notebook, but to grasp Michael's forearm, intent on spinning him around for a pat-down. The moment Craig's fingers made contact with his sleeve, Michael reacted. It wasn't a fight, it was a definitive, principled withdrawal. Sensitive work. Craig mocked the phrase. Michael let out a slow, deliberate breath as if releasing the temptation to argue with the caricature Craig was painting. He focused on Danvers. Officer, I've explained I'm conducting work. I'm on a public sidewalk. I've broken no laws. I pulled my arm back when Officer Craig attempted to grab me without cause. I am standing here, not fleeing, not threatening anyone. I am trying to avoid a conflict, but I know my rights, and they are being violated. Danvers shifted his weight uncomfortable. He looked at Craig. Did he actually commit a crime, or are we just on a stop and identify? Craig's glare was a physical force meant to silence. He's obstructing. He's suspicious. That's enough. We're not law professors, Danvers. We're cops. Use your eyes. The younger officer fell silent, the institutional weight of Craig's seniority and confidence pressing down on him. He saw the notebook's outline in Michael's pocket. He saw the man's calm defiance, which in the coded language of the patrol car could be read as disrespect. The safer path, the one that promised no friction with his partner, was clear. Michael saw the decision settle on Danvers' face, the slight resignation, the averted eyes. It was the look of complicity, of the system folding in on itself to preserve its own momentum. A profound disappointment deeper than anger settled behind Michael's eyes. Enough of this, Craig growled, sensing the tipping point. The backup had arrived, reaffirming his authority. The witness was compliant. The narrative was his to control. He reached to his belt, the familiar heavy click of the handcuff case opening sounding obscenely loud. A turnaround. Put your hands behind your back. The command hung in the strobe-lit air. Michael hesitated. His jaw tightened briefly. A fleeting crack in the calm facade, a raw human moment of outrage and insult. He looked from Craig's determined face to Danvers's conflicted one, then past them to the dark watching windows of the homes whose safety Craig claimed to be protecting. This was the precipice. To submit was to endorse the illegitimacy of the arrest. To resist was to give Craig the violent confrontation he seemed to be itching for. With a stillness that spoke of immense internal control, Michael made his choice. He turned slowly, presenting his back to Craig. He placed his hands behind him, wrists together. Craig stepped forward, the cuffs gleaming in his hand. There was an unnecessary force in his movements, a rough grab of Michael's wrist, a too tight cinch of the first metal band, then the second. The click of the ratchets engaging was final, a sound of concrete reality replacing argument. Craig secured the cuffs with a practiced tug, tighter than protocol demanded, a silent assertion of victory. As the cold metal bit into his wrists, Michael spoke, his voice quiet but clear, carrying a weight that the siren's echo couldn't drown. "Officer," he said, not turning his head, "this is a mistake." Craig sneered, leaning close to Michael's ear, his voice a low, triumphant grumble. We'll see about that." He took Michael firmly by the arm, his grip possessive, and guided him toward the open back door of his cruiser. The ritual was familiar. A hand on the detainee's head to avoid a doorframe injury, a push into the hard plastic seat, the smell of stale coffee, and antiseptic cleaner. As he was guided into the cage, Michael glanced back one last time. His eyes found Danvers, who was lingering by the fender of his own car, staring at the ground. The younger officer's expression was troubled, etched with a dawning, queasy doubt. But the flashing lights and the momentum of the arrest swallowed any objection he might have voiced. He remained silent. Craig slammed the door shut, the solid thunk sealing Michael in a plastic and metal compartment. Through the heavy security glass, their eyes met for a final moment before Craig turned away. Michael's gaze wasn't one of pleading or fear. It was observational, analytical, as if he were the one cataloging the steps of a procedure and Craig was the subject under review. The drive to the station would be silent. But in the back seat, with his hands secured behind him, Michael's mind was already racing, clear and focused, drafting the report that would end a career. The arrest was complete. The mistake, irrevocable, was now Officer Craig's to own. The heavy door of the patrol car sealed with a definitive, muffled thunk, plunging Michael into a world of distorted sound and palpable isolation. The plastic partition between the front and back seats was smeared with old fingerprints and a fine layer of dust warping Craig's silhouette into a vague, authoritative shadow. The only clear sounds were the rumble of the engine, the crackle of the police radio dispatching other, distant crises, and the rush of asphalt beneath the tires. In the driver's seat, Officer Craig's earlier agitation had cooled into a hard, satisfied certainty. He adjusted the rearview mirror to get a better look at his catch. Michael sat perfectly upright, his gaze fixed on the world passing by the window. The darkened shops, the occasional late-night pedestrian, the blur of streetlights. His hands were secured behind his back, but his posture wasn't one of defeat. It was one of intense, focused observation. He was studying the route, noting landmarks, his mind working behind a face of impassive calm. This calm, which had irritated Craig on the sidewalk, now began to gnaw at him in the closed confines of the car. Where was the fear, the anger, the desperate bargaining? This man's silence felt like judgment. Craig cleared his throat, a loud, unnecessary sound. "Comfortable back there?" he asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. He didn't expect an answer, and he didn't get one. Michael didn't even glance toward the mirror. Craig's smirk faltered. He turned his attention to the radio, keying the mic. Unit 7 en route to central booking with one in custody. Male suspicious conduct obstruction. He used the official jargon, building the paper trail that would justify his night's work. The dispatcher acknowledged with a static-filled a copy. The system was in motion, validating his actions. The silence returned, thicker now. Craig's eyes kept flicking back to the mirror. Michael hadn't moved. He was a statue, a part of Craig's brain, the part not fueled by bias and bruised ego, registered a faint, discordant alarm. This wasn't normal behavior for a guilty man. Guilty men cried, or lied, or sat slumped in resignation. This man was waiting, and he was waiting with the patience of someone who held a winning hand he hadn't yet revealed. To silence his own creeping disquiet, Craig filled the void with his own narrative. "Oh, you picked the wrong neighborhood to go prowling in," he said, more to himself than to his prisoner. "A people in Pine Grove pay taxes. They expect us to keep the trash out." He let the ugly word hang, watching for a reaction, a flinch, a tightening of the jaw, anything, nothing. The indifference was a deeper insult than any curse. Craig felt his satisfaction curdle. He was a ghost to this man, an inconvenience, not an authority. He gripped the steering wheel tighter, focusing on the road ahead, on the fluorescent glow of the police station now visible in the distance. The fortress, his domain. There, the protocols would formalize his victory. The paperwork would make it real. A few minutes later, the cruiser pulled into the bay of the central precinct. The fluorescent lights inside were harsh and unforgiving, bleaching color from everything they touched. Craig parked, killed the engine, and took a moment to compose himself. He smoothed his uniform, pushed his shoulders back, and reinflated his sense of purpose. He was bringing in a problem. He had done his job. He opened the back door. "How?" he commanded. He commanded. Michael moved smoothly, unfolding himself from the low seat without the awkward fumbling most restrained people exhibited. As he stood, his eyes immediately swept the booking area. The scuffed linoleum floor, the high desk, the holding cell doors, the tired-looking sergeant peering at a computer screen. It was another assessment, another environment to catalog. Craig took a firm grip on Michael's arm above the elbow, a display of control for anyone watching. He marched him across the short distance to the booking desk. The grip was unnecessarily tight, a final, petty assertion of dominance. The desk sergeant, a middle-aged woman with graying hair pulled into a severe bun and eyes that had seen every flavor of human trouble, looked up from her paperwork. Her nameplate read SGT Mora. Her gaze took in the scene. The overly assertive officer, the calm, cuffed man. Her expression, permanently set to weary neutrality, didn't change, but a spark of professional curiosity ignited in her eyes. "What's this about, Craig?" she asked, her voice flat, bypassing pleasantries. "I caught him prowling around Pine Grove Lane," Craig declared, his voice loud in the quiet room. Refused to explain himself, refused to hand over evidence he was carrying. Suspicious behavior all around. Had to insist on his cooperation. He delivered the summary as a fait accompli. Sergeant Mora's eyes shifted to Michael. "That's so." Michael met her gaze. His voice when he spoke was measured, clear, and cut through Craig's bluster like a laser. "I was standing on a public sidewalk, Sergeant." I was not trespassing. I was not threatening anyone. I was conducting my work. This officer decided my presence was a crime and escalated the situation when I asserted my rights. The sergeant's eyebrow lifted almost imperceptibly. She'd heard 1,000 variations of this, but the calm, precise delivery was unusual. She looked back at Craig. Did he resist arrest? Physically? Craig shifted his weight. He pulled away when I went to detain him. Was verbally obstructive. I pulled my arm back when he attempted to grab me without legal justification, Michael clarified, his tone never rising. I stated I was not resisting. I was preventing an unlawful seizure. The semantic distinction was crucial, and Sergeant Mora heard it. She sighed, a sound of bureaucratic inevitability. All right, let's process him and figure this out. Her tone suggested the figuring out might involve more than just Craig's report. Craig, interpreting her response as procedural green light, nodded with renewed confidence. He led Michael toward the holding area. As they passed a small, glass-walled office, Michael's head turned slightly. On the desk inside, a nameplate was visible, Special Agent Williams, Federal Bureau of Investigation. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched Michael's lips, there and gone in an instant. It was not a smile of hope, but of confirmation. The game was already over. Officer Craig just didn't know he had lost. Craig, seeing nothing, shoved Michael gently toward the open door of a holding cell. In you go. Make yourself at home. Michael walked in without a word. The door clanged shut behind him, the lock engaging with a solid clack. Craig turned and walked back to the main desk, a swagger in his step. He leaned on the high counter near Sergeant Mora. Another one off the streets, he muttered, reaching for a clipboard to start his report. The sergeant looked at him sharply, her tired eyes suddenly clear and penetrating. Don't pat yourself on the back too quickly, Ben, she said, her voice low. Let's see if there's even a charge that'll stick. From inside the dim holding cell, Michael heard the exchange. He slowly sat down on the hard metal bench, his back against the cold cinder block wall. He didn't slump by. He sat with the straight-back patience of a man waiting for a scheduled meeting to begin. The first phase was complete. The arrest was logged. The mistake was now a matter of record. All that remained was for the right person to read it. The holding cell was a study in sensory deprivation and slow time. The walls were painted a glossy, industrial beige that reflected the dim, buzzing light from a cage-protected fixture in the ceiling. The air smelled of old sweat, cheap disinfectant, and the faint metallic tang of fear left by previous occupants. A stainless steel toilet sink combination occupied one corner. The only furniture was a narrow metal bench bolted to the wall. Michael sat on this bench, not slouched in despair, but with his back straight, his cuffed hands resting in his lap. He might have been a meditator in a Spartan retreat. His eyes were closed, but he wasn't sleeping. He was auditing the sounds of the precinct, the distant murmur of voices, the clack of a keyboard, the occasional burst of radio static. He was timing the rhythms of the place, understanding its pulse. Nearly an hour had bled by since the cell door had clanged shut. In that hour, Officer Craig had finished his preliminary report at the booking desk, his narrative firm and self-justifying. He'd gotten a fresh coffee and was now leaning against a filing cabinet, exchanging low, cynical banter with another officer about a different arrest. He cast occasional, satisfied glances toward the holding cells. His problem was contained. Inside the cell, Michael opened his eyes. His gaze was clear, focused. He had waited long enough. The machinery of the precinct had settled into its routine. It was time to introduce a wrench. He shifted slightly on the bench and raised his voice. It wasn't a shout. It was a firm, clear, declarative statement that carried perfectly through the bars and into the heart of the booking area. I need to speak with someone in charge. The words sliced through the low-grade office hum. Conversations paused. Officer Craig, mid-sentence in his story, stiffened. He turned slowly, a scowl deepening the lines on his face. He walked over to the cell, stopping just outside the bars. We'll speak when I say you can speak, Craig said, his voice a low growl meant to reestablish the extinguished dynamic of the street. From her desk, Sergeant Moore looked up. Boondoggie's. Craig rolled his eyes, an exaggerated gesture of contempt for the bureaucratic red tape that protected even the people he was sure were guilty. He shot a glare at Michael, who simply looked back at him, waiting. The calm was infuriating. Fine," Craig muttered, stomping back to the booking desk. He snatched up the phone, dialing the extension for the watch commander with sharp, angry jabs of his finger. He put the receiver to his ear, turning his back slightly to the cells as if to shield his conversation. "Yeah, it's Craig in booking. I've got a guy in custody demanding to speak to someone higher up." He paused, listening, his shoulders tense. Yeah, the Pine Grove stop. Won't stop yapping about his rights. Okay, fine." He slammed the phone down harder than necessary. The sound echoed. Odd. He turned back toward the cell, his keys jangling as he pulled the heavy ring from his belt. The smirk was back, but it was thinner now, stretched over a layer of fresh irritation. Congratulations. You got your audience. Let's go." He unlocked the cell door, which swung open with a metallic groan. Michael stood smoothly and walked out, his movements still unnervingly composed. Craig took him by the arm again, the grip still too tight, and guided him past the booking desk, down a short, brightly lit corridor lined with administrative offices. The other officers in the room watched them go, a silent audience to this strange, quiet procession. They stopped at a closed door with a frosted glass panel. A stenciled sign read, "Watch Commander." Craig didn't bother to knock. He pushed the door open, his body language broadcasting his annoyance. "Aight, sir, this is the individual from the Pine Grove incident," Craig announced, marching Michael inside. The office was small but neat. A desk was stacked with tidy piles of paperwork. Behind it stood a man, but he wasn't in a police uniform. He was tall, with a lean, athletic build, dressed in a crisp charcoal gray suit that spoke of a different kind of authority. His tie was knotted perfectly. A silver badge was clipped to his belt, but it wasn't a sheriff's star or a city shield. It was the seal of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. His nameplate on the desk confirmed it, Special Agent Daniel Williams. His expression was neutral, professional, but his eyes held a sharp, assessing intelligence. Craig, still holding Michael's arm, began his spiel. "Sir, as I reported, this individual was engaged in suspicious—" Agent Williams held up a single hand, palm out. The gesture was quiet but absolute. It stopped Craig's words dead. Williams's attention remained fixed on Michael. Then he did something that made the blood drain from Craig's face. He stepped around the desk and extended his hand toward Michael. "Agent Holloway," Williams said, his voice calm, deep, and freighted with professional courtesy. "I got your signal. Sorry for the interruption." Michael, Agent Holloway, reached out with his cuffed hands, an awkward but purposeful movement, and shook Williams' hand firm. "Appreciate you coming, Agent Williams. The local hospitality has been overzealous." The air in the small office turned to ice. The fluorescent lights seemed to buzz louder. Craig's hand, still on Michael's arm, went slack and fell away. His mouth hung open slightly. He blinked as if trying to clear a sudden, devastating fog from his vision. The two men in suits shaking hands over the handcuffs he had applied was an image that bypassed his understanding and went straight to a primal, career-ending dread. Wait," Craig managed to croak, the word barely audible. He wouldn't say who he was. Agent Williams' gaze finally shifted from Michael to Craig. The warmth that had been there a second before was gone, replaced by a glacial, analytical coldness. "Is this true?" Williams asked, his voice dangerously even. He wasn't asking Michael. He was asking the universe for confirmation of a profound professional failure. Did you detain and arrest an active federal agent without probable cause and without even verifying his identity? The question wasn't rhetorical. It was an indictment wrapped in a query. Craig stammered, his brain frantically scrambling through the memory of the stop, searching for a foothold. I didn't know." He wouldn't identify himself. He was acting suspicious. He had a notebook. He was conducting a surveillance operation on a protected witness safe house 3 doors down from where you stopped me. Michael cut in, his voice now stripped of all civilian pretense. It was the flat, precise tone of a federal report. "One operation you have now potentially compromised. My notebook contains classified observational data. My evasiveness was adherence to operational security. Your backup call and flashing lights were a signal flare to anyone watching." Each sentence was a hammer blow. Craig felt the ground, the very foundation of his 15-year career, crack and crumble beneath his feet. He wasn't a cop who made a tough call. He was a liability, a dangerous, prejudiced fool who had just blundered into the middle of a federal investigation. Agent Williams's eyes never left Craig's pale, stricken face. "A step outside, officer," he said, the title sounding like an insult. "Wait there." Craig moved as if in a dream, his legs numb. He stumbled out of the office, the door clicking shut behind him, leaving him alone in the brightly lit hallway. The muffled sound of the two federal agents beginning to speak on the other side of the door was the only sound in his suddenly hollow world. The victory of the arrest had vaporized, leaving behind only the ash of a catastrophic, unforgivable mistake. The solid click of the watch commander's office door shutting behind him felt to Officer Craig like the ceiling of a tomb. His own. He stood frozen in the harshly lit corridor, the muffled, indistinct murmur of voices from the other side of the frosted glass the only sound in his ringing ears. The world had not just shifted, it had inverted. The suspicious prowler, the uncooperative subject, the man whose wrist he had gripped with such assertive ownership moments before, was a federal agent. The cuffs he had applied with such certainty were now a grotesque career-ending mistake locked around his own future. Inside the office, the atmosphere was cold and professional. Special Agent Williams gestured to a chair. "Please, Michael, sit." Michael Holloway lowered himself into the chair, the handcuffs making the movement slightly awkward. Williams didn't immediately move to remove them. The visual of the restrained agent was part of the gravity of the situation. He leaned against his desk, arms crossed, his expression that of a surgeon assessing catastrophic damage. "Let's get this straight," Williams began, his voice devoid of the heat of anger, which made it all the more severe. "How much of the Harbison operation did this incident just compromise?" Michael let out a slow breath, the professional mask slipping just enough to reveal the genuine frustration beneath. "It's impossible to quantify fully, Dan. The safe house on Pine Grove is the primary location for the accountant Miller before his deposition next week. My role was perimeter pattern analysis, logging comings and goings, identifying any counter-surveillance. Tonight was critical. We had intel suggesting a reconnaissance team might be doing exactly what I was doing, casing the area." He paused, gesturing slightly with his cuffed hands. "Instead, I became the main event. A marked patrol car, flashing lights, a public arrest. If there was anyone watching, they've been spooked. Miller's security profile is now a question mark. We may need to relocate him. The timeline is blown." Williams closed his eyes for a brief second, rubbing his temple. A multi-month operation, 6 agencies coordinating, potentially set back because a local patrolman saw a black man with a notebook. "It highlights the secondary problem," Michael said, his tone sharpening. He leaned forward, the metal of the cuffs scraping against the chair. "Officers like him aren't just a public relations nightmare. They are an active operational security risk. Their bias isn't just offensive, it's a vulnerability. It clouds judgment, bypasses protocol, and creates chaos exactly where we need invisibility and precision." He didn't see a person doing a job. He saw a stereotype that threatened his sense of order, and he escalated until he felt back in control. That kind of thinking doesn't just hurt communities, Dan. It gets people killed. It buries cases. Outside, Craig remained rooted to the spot. The door opened and Sergeant Morrow walked down the hall toward him, her footsteps measured. She stopped, looking at his ashen face, the sheen of sweat on his brow. "You've really done it this time, Ben," she said, her voice low and devoid of any collegial warmth. It was a simple statement of fact. Craig's head snapped up, a last-ditch defiance flickering in his panicked eyes. "How was I supposed to know? He wasn't cooperating. He looked like a man you'd already decided was guilty," Maura interrupted, her voice cutting. "That's the issue. You didn't bother to ask the right questions. So you jumped to a conclusion, and now it's biting the entire department in the ass. That's an FBI agent in there. Do you have any idea the storm that's about to hit?" Before Craig could muster a reply, the office door opened again. Agent Williams stood in the doorway, his frame blocking the light. His gaze swept past Craig to Sergeant Morrow. "Sergeant, I need a full incident report started immediately. Body cam footage, dispatch logs, the officer's initial report, and his formal statement. I want everything. Craig found his voice strained and defensive. Look, I didn't do anything wrong. The guy was acting suspicious. I was just doing my job. Williams's stare was like a physical force. Your job, officer, is to protect and serve and to uphold the law, not to harass and assume. You didn't ask questions. You didn't follow basic investigatory protocol. You saw a man and made up a story about him. He stepped aside as Michael emerged from the office, the handcuffs now gone, his wrists bearing faint red marks. Michael rubbed one wrist, his eyes locking onto Craig. Your job, Michael echoed, his voice quieter than Williams's but somehow carrying more weight, is to de-escalate, not to invent a threat where none exists. You didn't stop a crime tonight. You became an obstruction to a federal investigation. How much damage you caused, we'll find out. Craig's bravado crumbled. I didn't know he was FBI. He didn't identify himself. Michael took a step closer and Craig instinctively recoiled. I didn't identify myself because I was undercover officer in the middle of an active operation. Something I would have been forced to reveal with proper protocol if you had established probable cause. You never got that far. You went from suspicion to detention to arrest based on nothing but your own prejudice. The hallway felt oppressively small. Other officers had paused in their duties, watching the scene unfold near the watch commander's office. The silence was profound. Williams turned back to Sergeant Mora. I will be initiating a formal complaint with your Internal Affairs Division. This isn't just about tonight. It's about a pattern of conduct that endangers the public and undermines legitimate law enforcement. This department needs to take a very hard look at its practices. The word complaint seemed to physically strike Craig. His shoulders slumped. A complaint? Are you serious? Michael answered, his gaze unwavering. Dead serious. Your behavior wasn't just reckless. It was dangerous. And this isn't just about me. It's about the countless other people you've probably treated this way who didn't have the benefit of a federal badge to protect them. He let that hang in the air, the implication clear. For every Michael Holloway, with resources and authority, there were dozens of ordinary people who had suffered the same bias silently. Craig said nothing. He just stared at the scuffed linoleum floor, the reality of his actions, the public humiliation, the internal investigation, the certain suspension, the possible termination, crashing down on him in relentless wave. Michael looked at him for a long moment, his anger giving way to something colder, grim resolution. This isn't about ruining your career, officer. It's about accountability. Because if no one holds you accountable for this, what's to stop you from doing it to someone else tomorrow? Someone whose story ends very differently than mine did tonight. He gave a slight final nod to Sergeant Mora, then turned with Agent Williams walking back down the hall toward the exit, leaving Officer Craig standing alone in the fluorescent glare, the architect of his own professional ruin. The first wave of the fallout had hit. The tsunami was still gathering far out at sea. The days following the incident at the Pine Grove precinct did not bring quiet. They brought a slow, inexorable unraveling. For Officer Ben Craig, the world contracted to the four walls of his home, the incessant buzz of his silenced phone, and the grim, formal letters on departmental letterhead that arrived like subpoenas from a future he could no longer control. The storm Agent Williams had promised arrived not with a bang, but with the sterile, methodical precision of internal affairs. An investigation was launched immediately. Craig was placed on administrative leave, his badge and service weapons surrendered. The initial interview was a cold, procedural affair. The Aya detectives, their faces masks of neutral detachment, asked questions that seemed designed to excavate his thought process that night. Walk us through your initial observation. What specific behaviors led you to believe a crime was in progress? At what point did you establish probable cause for a detention? Did you consider alternative explanations for his behavior? Each question was a trapdoor. His answers, he looked out of place, he was taking notes, he was evasive, which had felt so solid in the moment, now sounded thin, prejudiced, and utterly divorced from legal standard. He kept circling back to his defense. He didn't identify himself. The Aya detective's response was a silent, patient stare, waiting for him to hear how hollow it sounded. Then they began pulling his record. Every arrest report, every use of force filing, every citizen complaint over his 15-year career was extracted from the archives and laid bare. The pattern that emerged was not one of heroic crime fighting, but of a consistent, low-grade friction with a certain segment of the populace. He had a history of stops for furtive movements and a failure to maintain eye contact. A disproportionate number of his arrests were of young Black and Hispanic men, often for misdemeanor offenses like loitering or disorderly conduct, charges that were frequently pled down or dismissed. Several old complaints, long buried, resurfaced. Allegations of disrespect, of overly aggressive conduct, of a driving while Black stops. At the time, they'd been one person's word against a decorated officer's. Now, viewed through the lens of his catastrophic encounter with Agent Holloway, they formed a damning mosaic of bias. At the station, the atmosphere was tense and fractured. The story had leaked, of course. Whispers followed Craig on the one day he was required to come in to meet with his union rep. Some officers, those of a similar mindset, clapped him on the shoulder and muttered about FBI snakes and politics. But more avoided his eyes, their expressions a mixture of pity and professional distaste. He had become a liability, a walking reminder of the cost of bad judgment. Sergeant Mora offered no greetings, her disapproval a tangible force. The younger officer, Danvers, whom Craig had effectively silenced on the scene, was reportedly cooperating fully with the AA, with his statement likely emphasizing Craig's aggressive escalation. Meanwhile, Michael Holloway's world was one of damage assessment and controlled fury. He had returned to the FBI field office, where the Harbison operation was now in a precarious holding pattern. The safe house was considered potentially compromised. The witness, Miller, was anxious and demanding new assurances. Weeks of meticulous work had to be recalibrated because a patrolman's suspicion had overridden his training. Michael filed his own voluminous report, a clinical, minute-by-minute breakdown of the unlawful stop and arrest. It was entered into evidence alongside the damning body camera footage, which, when Michael and Williams reviewed it, showed in stark high definition what they already knew. Craig's immediate aggression, his dismissal of Michael's rights, the complete absence of any legitimate articulable suspicion. The incident, given the players involved, was too explosive to remain a quiet internal matter. A week after the arrest, the police chief, looking grim and decades older, held a press conference flanked by the head of internal affairs. Cameras flashed. We take these allegations with the utmost seriousness, the chief intoned, reading from a prepared statement. The officers of this department are sworn to uphold the law with fairness and integrity. Any actions that betray that trust or that are influenced by bias will be investigated fully and addressed with appropriate disciplinary action. He did not say Craig's name, but everyone knew. The community reaction was a fault line cracking open. In online forums and local news comment sections, a war of narratives erupted. Some residents of Pine Grove Lane and similar neighborhoods voiced their support for Craig. He was just keeping our streets safe. The real crime is the FBI hiding in our bushes, they wrote. But a louder, more passionate response came from community advocates, civil rights groups, and ordinary citizens who had long held their tongues. They spoke of fear of humiliation, of sons and husbands taught to keep their hands visible during traffic stops. Ouch. Michael's story was not an anomaly to them. It was a validation. It gave a name, a face, and a shocking twist of poetic justice to an experience they knew intimately. Michael himself remained publicly silent, letting the process unfold. But in his testimony to the Internal Affairs panel, he was devastatingly clear. He sat in a conference room facing the stone-faced investigators and spoke not as a victim, but as an expert witness on the mechanics of prejudice. When I walk into a neighborhood, he said, his voice calm and precise, I am not just a man to an officer like Craig. I am every stereotype, every unexamined fear, every shortcut his mind has ever taken. My calm becomes defiance. My professionalism becomes evasion. My very presence becomes a threat that must be neutralized. That night wasn't about me. It was about the lens through which he saw me. And the tragedy is, that lens was issued to him, polished by a culture that too often winks at that kind of instinct. He is a symptom. Your investigation into him is a test of whether this department is serious about curing the disease. His words were transcribed, circulated, and later leaked to the press. They became the anchor for editorials and the fuel for community town hall meetings that drew crowds demanding reform. mandatory de-escalation training, independent review boards, the dismantling of our pretextual stop policies. Craig, watching the news from his living room couch, saw his life being dissected on television. He heard his actions framed not as a mistake, but as a case study in systemic failure. The righteous certainty that had fueled him on Pine Grove Lane had curdled into a sickening panic, chased by the first unwelcome stirrings of a reckoning he had spent a lifetime avoiding. The unraveling was no longer just professional, it was personal. The mirror was being held up, and for the first time, Ben Craig was being forced to look. The official notification of his termination from the force did not arrive with drama. There was no final, fiery confrontation in the chief's office, no dramatic surrender of a badge already taken. It came in a thick, cream-colored envelope, delivered by a uniformed courier who required a signature. The envelope bore the embossed seal of the city and the police department's insignia. It felt heavy in Ben Craig's hands, a dense packet of finality. He stood in the doorway of his quiet house, the morning sun feeling obscenely cheerful. He closed the door, the sound echoing in the empty hall. In the empty hall. His wife had taken the kids to her sister's for the week, a breaky, she'd said, her eyes avoiding his. The house was a museum of his former life. Framed photos from police academy graduation, a softball trophy from a departmental league, a shadow on the wall where his duty belt had hung for 15 years. He carried the envelope to the kitchen table, the same table where he'd once grumbled about shift schedules and complained about apolitical arrest quotas. He used a steak knife to slice it open, the tearing sound absurdly loud. Inside was a cover letter on official letterhead and a sheaf of attached documents. The language was dry, legalistic, and utterly merciless. After a comprehensive investigation by the Office of Internal Affairs, and in consideration of the findings presented, a pattern of conduct inconsistent with the ethical standards and operational protocols of this department, specifically the incident of September 12th, which demonstrated a profound failure of judgment, a violation of lawful detention procedures and conduct that brought the department into disrepute. Compounded by a review of prior conduct indicating a predisposition to biased enforcement. Your employment is hereby terminated, effective immediately. All departmental property must be accounted for. You will be ineligible for rehire, and your pension benefits are subject to review. It went on. There were specific citations of policy violations. There were references to the statements of Agent Michael Holloway and Special Agent Daniel Williams. There was a cold, bullet-pointed summary of the IA panel's conclusions. His entire career was reduced to a clinical damning autopsy report. Craig's hands began to shake. The sterile words blurred on the page. He had known this was coming. Through the agonizing weeks of leave, the tense meetings with his union rep who grew increasingly quiet and defeated, the whispers that became silence when he walked into a room, he had known. But knowing and seeing it formalized in black and white, under the city seal, were different things. This was the institution he had sworn to protect formally disowning him. It was a divorce decree from his own identity. A sound escaped him, a choked, raw thing that was part gasp, part sob. He dropped the papers as if they were on fire. They scattered across the cheap pine tabletop. The cover letter fluttered to the floor. He pushed back from the table, the chair legs screeching against the tile. He needed air. He stumbled to the sliding glass door that led to his small, neglected backyard. He fumbled with the latch, his fingers clumsy, and shoved it open, stumbling out onto the cracked patio. The sunlight was a mockery. The ordinary sounds of his neighborhood, a lawnmower a few yards over, a dog barking, the distant whine of a plane, felt like a taunt. The world was continuing. Life was proceeding. And his was over. He leaned against the warm brick of his house, squeezing his eyes shut. The images came unbidden, not in a flood, but in sharp, stabbing flashes. The haughty, calm look on Michael's face under the streetlight. The feel of the cold handcuffs as he snapped them shut. The way Agent Williams had extended his hand not to him, but to the man in cuffs. The expression on Sergeant Mora's face, not anger, but profound, professional disappointment. For weeks, his anger had been his fuel. Anger at the FBI for being secretive, anger at the system for not backing its own. Anger at Holloway for not just showing a badge and making it easy. But here, alone in his backyard with the official proof of his ruin in the house behind him, the anger evaporated. What rushed in to fill the vacuum was far worse. A yawning, terrifying clarity. What if he'd been wrong? Not just about that night, but about all of it? The hunches he'd followed, the attitudes he'd corrected, the young men he'd stopped whose fear he'd mistaken for guilt. Complaint letters he dismissed as the griping of criminals. What if the lens through which he'd viewed his entire job, his entire world, had been warped from the start? He saw Michael Holloway's face again, not as a suspect's, but as a federal agent's. A professional doing a job, a man with a purpose and authority Craig couldn't even comprehend. And Craig had seen only a threat. He had looked at competence and seen conspiracy. He had looked at dignity and seen defiance. A wave of nausea rolled through him. He opened his eyes, staring at the overgrown grass, the rusting grill, the fence that needed painting. This was his kingdom now. This patio, this silence. Inside, his phone buzzed on the counter. He knew who it would be. A reporter smelling blood in the water. Or maybe his union rep with a hollow consolation. Or maybe one of the few remaining buddies from the job, their voices strained with awkward pity. He didn't move to answer it. The buzzing eventually stopped. The verdict was in. The gavel had fallen. Officer Ben Craig was gone. What remained was just Ben, a man in a backyard beginning the long, silent, and excruciating work of facing what he had done, and more horrifyingly, who he had been. The external consequences were now official, documented, and sealed. The internal trial, the one that would define the rest of his life, was just beginning. And in that trial, he was both the accused and the only witness for the prosecution. The secure, soundproofed briefing room at the FBI field office was a world away from the hushed tension of a suburban sidewalk or the sterile glare of a precinct holding cell. Michael Holloway stood before a digital map of the city, laser pointer in hand, addressing a team of 8 agents. His voice was crisp, his analysis sharp. The Harbison operation had been salvaged, the witness relocated under a new protocol. A different target was now their focus, a money laundering network tied to offshore accounts. The work continued. The mission was all that mattered. As he wrapped up the briefing, dismissing the team to their tasks, a junior agent lingered. Sir," the young man said, hesitating. "That thing with the local PD, I read the summary. Is it harder to work with them now?" Michael considered the question, capping his laser pointer. "It's a reminder," he said, his tone measured. "Our job is to see what's actually there, not what we're afraid of or what we assume must be there. That officer forgot that. Our effectiveness depends on never making that mistake." The answer was professional, a lesson framed in tradecraft. The young agent nodded, taking it as operational wisdom. Alone in the briefing room, Michael's gaze drifted to the cityscape beyond the reinforced window. The professional mask softened for a moment. He thought of the notebook, the one Craig had demanded. It was now logged as evidence in an internal affairs file, its mundane, coded observations part of a disciplinary record. He thought of the wasted hours, the frayed nerves of a protected witness, the bureaucratic morass of formal complaints. A righteous outcome, yes, but a staggering inefficiency born of one man's poisoned perception. The ripple effects of that inefficiency were now being felt in small but tangible ways within the very police department that had housed Officer Craig. The internal affairs report had been a seismic event. The chief, under intense scrutiny from city council and community groups wielding Michael's case as a prime example, had announced reforms. They were modest, bureaucratic, but they were cracks in a long, solid facade. All patrol officers were now required to attend a newly mandated procedural justice and implicit bias training module. It was a 4-hour session filled with statistics, role-playing scenarios, and uncomfortable discussions about a de-escalation and a proportional response. In the back of the classroom, veterans like the now silent Officer Danvers sat with arms crossed, while newer recruits took earnest notes. The instructor played a redacted audio clip from a stop. It wasn't from Michael's encounter, but it could have been. The room grew very quiet. Furthermore, a pilot program for a civilian-led community oversight board was established. Its power was advisory only, a fact critics loudly denounced as toothless. But for the first time, citizen complaints would be reviewed by a panel that included a pastor, a school teacher, and a local business owner, not just other cops. It was a gesture, but gestures could become precedents. Michael learned of these changes through a terse official notification letter from the city's attorney, copied to Agent Williams. He read it once, then filed it away. He did not feel victory. He felt the grim satisfaction of a surgeon who has successfully removed a tumor, knowing the patient's recovery is long and the disease might have metastasized elsewhere. For Ben Craig, the echoes were of a different, more personal frequency. Stripped of his badge and the identity it conferred, he was adrift. Job applications to other security or law enforcement adjacent fields went unanswered. His name, he discovered, was quietly toxic. The few friends who remained were from the old blue world, and their conversations were now tinged with an awkwardness, unspoken chasm where shared purpose used to be. He found himself doing something he had never done before, listening, not to defend, but to hear. He watched the news coverage of other incidents in other cities with a new, gut-clenching awareness. He heard the phrases, "he fit the description," and "acting suspicious," and now heard the terrifying ambiguity he had once wielded with such confidence. He read the statements from community leaders about the corrosive effect of fear, and for the first time he wondered if he had been a source of that corrosion, not a shield from it. One afternoon, cleaning out his garage, he found a box of old academy materials. A booklet on constitutional law, its pages pristine. A photo of his graduating class, young faces brimming with idealism. He stared at his own face, frozen in time, and tried to trace the path from that eager recruit to the man on the Pine Grove sidewalk, seeing a threat in a man with a notepad. The disconnect was vast, and the bridge across it was built of 1,000 small, unquestioned assumptions he could no longer afford to ignore. The incident on Pine Grove Lane became, for a time, a local reference point. In community meetings, people would say, "We don't want another FBI agent situation here." In the police department, sergeants would warn, "Remember what happened to Craig. Do the job right." It was a cautionary tale, its details sanded down for easier telling. Michael, for his part, moved on to the next case and the one after that. The memory of the handcuffs clicking shut on his wrists did not haunt him. It fortified him. It was a data point, a stark reminder of the gap between the law as written and the law as applied through the filter of human fear. His work was to navigate that gap with truth and evidence. As the city's lights began to wink on in the dusk beyond his window, Michael shut down the briefing room monitor. The workday was over, but the lesson of Pine Grove Lane lingered. It was a lesson about the cost of assumptions. They were not free.